In his infamous speech on the morning of the invasion, Putin explicitly stated that stripping Ukraine of its military capabilities was one of his two primary war aims. The logic was simple. To effectively subjugate Ukraine, he first needed to render the country defenseless. 3 years and 9 months later, that plan has backfired so spectacularly that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte felt comfortable declaring that Russia is running out of money, troops and ideas. Putin's campaign to demilitarize Ukraine has instead created the most formidable military force in Europe, while simultaneously gutting Russia's own military capabilities in ways that will take decades to recover from, if not even longer. So, let's break down exactly how Putin managed to achieve the opposite of everything he set out to accomplish. Now, to understand the scale of Putin's failure, we need to start with what Ukraine looked like militarily when Russia invaded in 2014 and annexed Crimea. Kyiv had only a few thousand combat-ready troops at its disposal. The Ukrainian military was underfunded, poorly equipped, and largely unprepared for modern warfare. Most of its weapon stocks were inherited Soviet munitions, armor, vehicles, and aircraft. And Ukraine has been able to create supply chains to maintain only a fraction of them. Ukraine's economy was so bad and required external propping. It signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 and a private Russia-Ukraine agreement, and destroyed or transferred a large portion of its aircraft fleet back to Russia in return for security and debt relief, respectively. In response, Russia bided its time and seized Crimea with minimal resistance, while Ukraine was still reeling from corruption and rapid switches between pro- and anti-Russian governments. This led Putin to believe that Ukraine's military was nowhere near enough to mount a defense in a full-scale invasion scenario 8 years later. But that initial success in Crimea would actually spark Ukraine into action and directly lead to its regrowth. Realizing that Russia would never stop its aggressive advance, Ukraine switched gears and partnered with NATO to start training its forces since 2014, gaining years of experience in adaptive small-scale operations that were one of the cores of NATO's military doctrine. Today, Ukraine boasts Europe's second-largest army, Russia being the first, with roughly 880,000 men and women in uniform at the start of 2025, and a large reserve of battle-hardened combat veterans. Ukraine's military is now dwarfing anything else on the continent proper, even before Ukraine's unrivaled experience of modern warfare is taken into account. By comparison, the same estimate suggests there were only 600,000 Russian troops deployed in Ukraine at the time. A November 2025 report by Financial Times also suggested that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has agreed to cap Ukraine's active troop size to 800,000 if a peace deal is reached, which is close to the largest deployment. This implies that Ukraine has successfully petitioned the US administration to allow it to maintain its large standing army and continue the notion of it being a militarized state in response to Russian aggression and Europe's first layer of defense in the east. But raw troop numbers only tell part of the story. What's truly remarkable is the transformation of Ukraine's defense industry. When Russia invaded in 2022, Ukraine's defense industry capacity stood at a modest $1 billion against a total military budget of around $6 billion in 2021. By 2025, the $1 billion figure is expected to have exploded to an expected $35 billion. That's a 35-fold increase in just a bit under 4 years, accomplished while the country was under active bombardment. Most importantly, Ukraine now produces around 1/3 of all weapons, ammunition, and equipment used by the country's armed forces. In drone production, that figure approaches 100%. The drone industry deserves special attention. It represents perhaps the most stunning reversal of Putin's demilitarization goals. On February 24, 2022, Ukraine's entire military drone arsenal consisted of about 20 Turkish-made Bayraktar drones and some scattered volunteer units flying modified consumer quadcopters, literally wedding photography drones retrofitted with grenades attached using zip ties and electrical tape. Fast forward to 2025, and Ukraine is on track to produce 5 million FPV drones alone. That's more than 13,600 drones every single day. To put that in perspective, Ukraine's drone production is now outpacing Europe's artillery ammunition shipments to the country. The country has over 500 suppliers, ranging from major companies to garage workshops, all funded by NATO donations and Ukrainian government contracts. But these are more than just cheap flying bombs. The success rates of these drones have improved from about 30% in 2022 to 70% for high-quality systems by 2024. Ukraine has developed short-range attack drones, long-range strategic bombers capable of hitting targets over 1,800 miles away, interceptor drones that hunt other drones at 170 miles per hour, fiber optic controlled drones immune to jamming, and naval drones that have revolutionized maritime warfare. The capabilities Ukraine has developed are so advanced that NATO countries are now coming to Ukraine to learn. Ukrainian military personnel have been dispatched to Denmark, Poland, and the United Kingdom to train their forces in drone warfare. Denmark is learning from Ukraine after suspicious drone activity, possibly linked to Russia, violated Danish airspace. Poland established joint anti-drone training with Ukraine after Russian drones penetrated Polish territory. Britain is mass-producing drones developed in collaboration with Ukraine. The commander of the 1st Battalion of the 14th Separate Unmanned Aerial Vehicle Regiment of Ukraine's military, codenamed Casper, succinctly described the technological gap that Ukraine has created. Foreign models are like Toyotas now, while Ukrainian ones are Mercedes. Ours are just leagues ahead. Ukraine's military transformation isn't just about production numbers and training programs. It's about operational capabilities that have changed how we see modern warfare as a whole. Take Operation Spiderweb, for instance. Ukrainian intelligence spent 18 months planning an operation to hit Russian strategic bomber bases, not the ones near the border where you might expect drone attacks, but bases deep inside Russia, with the Belaya air base being 2,700 miles away in Siberia. That's almost like launching an attack on Alaska from New York. The true extent of the damage was that a non-nuclear power had successfully attacked, damaged, and even destroyed strategic bombers that could deploy nuclear weapons. Satellite imagery confirmed the destruction of at least 13 aircraft, while Ukrainian sources claimed they damaged 41 of them in total, about a third of Russia's entire strategic bomber fleet. At the best estimate for Russia, this was roughly 10% of its airbase arm of the nuclear triad. And Ukraine managed to do this with drones that cost maybe $400 each, destroying nuclear-capable aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars apiece. The Magura V5 and Sea Baby naval drones have systematically demolished Russian naval power. By mid-2025, Ukraine had destroyed or disabled roughly 40% of Russia's Black Sea fleet, sinking or destroying 10 Russian warships in 21 confirmed attacks. The symbolic low point came with the destruction of Russia's Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, which was when Russia ostensibly realized it couldn't blockade Ukraine's coast for long. The strategic consequences of naval drones went beyond a military victory and relieving pressure from its coast. By forcing Russian ships away from Ukrainian shipping lanes, they also secured Ukraine's economic survival. Ukraine's grain exports alone represent almost $11 billion in revenue annually, and 60% of the country's total agricultural trade, which is funding that helps sustain the war effort. While Ukraine was enjoying significant boosts to its productivity, Russia's military capabilities have gone in the exact opposite trajectory. According to Oryx, an online database that meticulously tracks and records destroyed and damaged equipment with visual confirmation, Russia has lost over 23,300 units of military equipment as of October 2025. Of those, around 14,000 losses are solely for armored vehicles, including over 4,200 tanks being damaged or destroyed in just 45 months of fighting. And remember, these are only the losses that could be visually confirmed with satellite, drone, Ukrainian drone surveillance, and independent sources. Some analysts suggest that visual records constitute between 80 and 90% of all equipment losses, meaning the true figure could even be higher. Now, let's put that in context. Russia started the war with around 3,300 tanks in active deployment, which were upgraded T-72, T-80, and T-90 tanks. The International Institute for Strategic Studies suggested Russia could have as many as 17,500 additional tanks in storage, mainly Soviet-era leftovers that were transferred from across the former Union back to the Russian Federation. In 2023, the IISS suggested that Russia had around 5,000 models of T-62 and newer tanks in storage, which was at that point considered the theoretical limit to what generation of tank was useful in modern wars. But by May 2022, just 3 months into the war, Russia had already started pulling the T-62s out of storage. This was followed by recommissioning T-54 and T-55s. By November 2024, 2.5 years into the war, Russia was deploying T-34s, tanks that were used in World War II. The situation gets worse when you look at production and restoration capabilities. Satellite imagery of storage and repair facilities shows that Russia has reduced its capacity to refit tanks from over 120 per month at the beginning of 2022 to just 35 by mid-2025. Russia can also produce around 400 contemporary tanks per year through new manufacturing, namely the T-90M and the T-80 BVM, but this is nowhere near enough to replace battlefield losses. The IISS also suggested that Russia might run out of tanks to use in 2026. While the specific wording doesn't imply all tanks will simply be gone, it could mean that Russia won't be able to launch mechanized infantry attacks at the same level it did in 2023 to 2025. And Russia's artillery situation is equally dire, if not more humiliating. According to Reuters analysis, North Korea is now supplying Russia with artillery shells used in Ukraine, with some battalions claiming to use between 50 and 100% of North Korean shells for their units. North Korea has been suggested to have sent between 4 and 6 million munitions over the course of the war. By comparison, Russia's domestic production is estimated at nearly 3 million artillery munitions per year, which is more than the entire NATO combined. But this still falls short of what's needed. Russian forces use approximately 10,000 shells per day. That's roughly 3.65 million per year, exceeding ballistic domestic production. And a later report suggested that production targets weren't met for 2024, with Russia producing only 2.3 million artillery shells. And half of the North Korean shells don't even work. Ukrainian intelligence reports that these munitions were made in the 1970s and 1980s, and likely only partially inspected before being shipped from old stocks to Russia. While this sounds like just another cog in the machine, Russia was actually relying on quite a lot from its artillery. Throughout the initial stages of the war, Russia made the advances it could because its vast stocks of artillery, coupled with overwhelming production capacity, meant it could literally litter the ground with artillery fire and prevent Ukraine from organizing a defense. Even when drones were becoming more effective and prevalent, modern artillery systems like the 2S-19 and its successor, the 2S-35 and 2S-45, could launch 8 to 10 rounds per minute to keep drone operators in check and far from the front. Russia's aviation industry also faces what can only be described as a comprehensive collapse. The public policy research organization RAND reported in 2024 that the Russian Air Force was likely flying at less than 75% of its pre-war capacity. RAND estimated that Russia was actively losing a total of 60 aircraft just from overuse and lack of proper maintenance. By contrast, Russia's military-industrial complex can only procure 26 new aircraft per year, including only 14 fighter jets. These jets have also become go-to platforms for lobbing glide bombs rather than the air superiority denial and ground troop support they were supposed to provide. The civilian aviation crisis compounds the military problem. Russia planned to build over 1,000 aircraft between 2023 and 2030, while current production indicated 5 planes were built over the course of 3 years. While the two industries are technically separate, the spare parts, maintenance expertise, and technologies aren't. Russia, being under Western sanctions for over 3 years, has had its access to the parts needed for both types of aircraft drastically cut. The lack of engineering capacity, as people who could work in the industry are either dying in the war or fleeing the country, means Russia is working overtime to replace Western planes with domestically produced aircraft. Then there are Russia's vaunted air defense systems. Despite being considered vital to Russian defenses, Multiple S-300 and S-400 launchers and radars have been destroyed by Ukraine since the start of the war, with Oryx listing over 30 pieces visually confirmed and a total of 330 surface-to-air missile systems destroyed or damaged. At the same time, exported S-300s proved entirely incapable of defending against more advanced Western threats. Israel reportedly managed to defeat all 4 systems that Russia sold to Iran, with seemingly no difficulties. Russia has been forced to pull systems all the way from Kaliningrad to serve bases closer to Ukraine, leaving other strategic locations vulnerable. Beyond the equipment losses, Russia faces a catastrophic human resources crisis that makes the material shortages look almost manageable by comparison. Mediazona has an updated 2025 estimate that suggests up to 219,000 Russian soldiers were killed up until August 2025. This aligns with Western estimates of over 1.1 million total casualties by mid-2025. But another estimate suggests as many as 1.44 million casualties by the end of 2025, with nearly 480,000 dead. Russia also faces a severe shortage of trained personnel to support its military operations. Russian officials have reported a shortage ranging from 160,000 to 400,000 workers and engineers in the defense industry, with the most conservative estimate suggesting 80,000 engineers were needed just to maintain current production levels. This aging and lacking workforce, combined with massive casualties, creates a vicious cycle. Russia needs more equipment to replace battlefield losses, but doesn't have the skilled workers to increase production, while simultaneously losing the personnel who could either train or become new workers. Now, all of these military shortages stem from economics, as Russia simply can't afford to sustain this war much longer. Russia's defense spending for 2025 exceeded 8% of GDP and accounted for 40% of total federal expenditure. Russia has managed to sustain this through reforms and tax increases, but these are short-term measures that have already started showing cracks. The 2026 budget has shown national defense investment to have shrunk by 8%, which would be counterintuitive for a country in active military conflict. The country's key export industries, oil and gas and arms manufacturing, have seen many hits from the war, with Ukraine damaging vital oil refining infrastructure and Russia needing to divert arms exports to domestic use with limited results. In numbers, oil and gas revenue was down 35% in June 2025 from the previous year, while arms sales plummeted to only 6% of 2021 levels. Russia's stagnation goes counter to its listed goal of demilitarizing Ukraine, but it also has a major ripple effect. Europe has started increasing its national defense efforts. Take the Coalition of the Willing, which is ostensibly the first fundamental shift in European security policy in decades. Proposed by France and the United Kingdom in February 2025, the coalition currently contains 34 countries, with the United States being one of the major absentees from the list. The coalition emerged specifically because the US was increasingly disengaging from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, especially after Trump's second term started at the beginning of 2025. In July 2025, the coalition reaffirmed its agreement to provide at least 40 billion euros, approximately $46.4 billion, in military support to Ukraine in 2025, matching the commitment made by the NATO alliance in 2024. But the coalition has become more than just a funding mechanism. In the October 2025 meeting, coalition members agreed to ramp up sanctions on Russia, force it to pay reparations, directly increase military pressure on Russia, and ensure Ukraine's security after the war ends. Individual European nations are also making substantial commitments. France and the UK have been discussing expanding their nuclear deterrence to cover the rest of Europe, freeing American missiles from their stockpiles across the continent and making Europe less dependent on US policy. Germany has agreed to increase military spending and investment to up to 5% of GDP, with roughly 1.5% dedicated to creating and maintaining infrastructure that would benefit the alliance as a whole. Poland is building the continent's largest army after Ukraine, while France and the UK have seen major reinvigorations in their missile and aircraft exports. This European solidarity is precisely what Putin gambled wouldn't happen. His invasion was premised on the belief that Europe would fragment, with energy dependence trumping security concerns and moral obligations. Instead, the EU could raise a standing army on par with the US itself. Russia's military failures in Ukraine have also fundamentally damaged its position in the global arms market. Russian equipment was popular with developing nations because it was relatively cheap, easy to maintain, and came with fewer political strings attached than Western alternatives. But years of watching Russian tanks burn, Russian aircraft get shot down, and Russian air defense systems fail to stop Ukrainian attacks have been the worst possible advertisement for Russian military hardware. China has seized this opportunity, directly competing with Russia for the same arms export clients. At the same time, China maintains close trading ties with Russia to access its resource reserves at discounted prices, essentially treating Russia as a junior partner rather than an equal. Meanwhile, previous Russian arms clients have seen the lack of success of Russian military equipment and pivoted in new directions. India, traditionally one of Russia's largest arms customers, has started seeking more Western weapons instead. Countries across Africa and the Middle East are reconsidering their defense procurement strategies. Beyond the numbers and economics, Russia's failure in Ukraine stems from something more fundamental: a military doctrine catastrophically unsuited for modern warfare, and a political system incapable of adapting to changing realities. So, where does this leave us? There are a few notable scenarios that we could be looking at in the coming years. Scenario 1. The slow grind to exhaustion. If you layer over the map from late 2022 and late 2025, the Russian holdings barely moved, with roughly 1% of Ukraine's territory changing hands over the course of 3 years. At this rate, we could be looking at hundreds of years of war, which is simply ridiculous and unrealistic. Instead, Putin might decide to settle and consolidate his current wins. And remember that the IISS assessment that Russia won't have sufficient main battle tanks for effective offensive operations beyond early 2026 supports this scenario. Russia would be forced to dramatically scale back operations, transitioning from offensive campaigns to a largely defensive posture while trying to hold onto occupied territories. This scenario might be Putin's least bad option, but it comes with massive problems. Russia's economy is structured around the war effort now, with defense spending at 40% of the federal budget. A transition to a static defensive war would require painful economic restructuring. While the military-industrial complex loses the inflated revenues it's become dependent on. Scenario 2. Regime instability and internal collapse. Putin's regime rests on perhaps just a few hundred key people in the security services, military command, and oligarchy. Currently, Putin's entire regime has such a stranglehold on these people that they have nothing to gain and everything to lose by working against him. But if these people start fearing for their own safety or long-term prospects, those same people could start believing that Putin is no longer working in their interests. Then we could see Putin ousted or replaced by someone who could take the country in a different direction, or at least present a different face for Western politics to engage with. If that happens, the country might cease to exist in its current iteration and be replaced by something entirely different. Scenario 3. The Pyrrhic victory. Even if Russia somehow prevails militarily and forces Ukraine into accepting territorial concessions, the victory will be Pyrrhic to the point of being indistinguishable from defeat. There are already hundreds of thousands of dead, another million injured and relying on social programs, with the country's economy turned inside out to support the war. It's also unclear whether Russia could force NATO to back out of supporting Ukraine in the future, meaning Ukraine would get security reassurances and also possibly ask for compensation for its losses. Russia would win 20% of Ukraine's territory, which still holds a Ukrainian population majority that would likely be openly hostile to a governmental switch and would be another leech on Russia's resources. Scenario 4. Ukraine's continued growth forces negotiation. This might be the most likely scenario based on current trends. As Ukraine's military capabilities continue expanding, the cost of continuing the war for Russia becomes increasingly unbearable. This could force Russia to start approaching the negotiating table, especially given that Trump has become increasingly aggressive in showing his annoyance with how the war was conducted throughout 2025. Ukraine would enter those negotiations with a battle-hardened million-person army, proven combat capabilities that exceed many NATO members, a domestic defense industry that produces more drones than most nations combined, and the backing of a united European coalition. It would be the ultimate irony. Putin's campaign to demilitarize Ukraine would end with Ukraine dictating terms from a position of military superiority. But regardless of the scenario, there's a pattern forming. The current trajectory that Russia is on likely indicates that the country is no longer even a contender for a world power. Putin might have destroyed Russia's ambitions and relegated it to a regional power that's subdued by China's resource and geopolitical demands. Thanks for watching. Now, if you want to understand how Ukraine plans to leverage its military transformation into potential peace negotiations, check out Ukraine's winning plan. And to stay current with the most significant developments in the war and their global implications, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.